So, I typically start every episode with a quote from someone else who relates to your work.
Okay.
And that's part of how I like to do like a weaving practice, whether it's like from ancestors or current people, just to like try and weave together thought.
Mhm.
And there are a lot of options for this conversation. And it would have been really fitting, of course, and obvious, I think, to use Octavia. And I quote from Adrienne Marie Brown all the time, so
Mhm.
I'm a little bit redundant, but there is a part uh, from Emergent Strategy that I thought was really fitting for this conversation. So I'm going to read you a bit of that if you're okay being read at for a second.
Yeah, sounds great.
So she says, Toni Cade Bambara, a Black feminist writer organizer who left lots of wisdom for us, said two things that I turn to when I start to wonder if art is enough of a contribution. On one hand, as I referenced earlier, she said the role of the artist is to make the revolution irresistible. On the other hand, she said that writing is one of the ways I participate in transformation. From this wisdom combination, I see that I'm charged to write about the revolutions I long for, and that any writing I do, even if it isn't explicitly political, is still a transformative act. I apply this to my songs, my self-portraits, my poems, understanding that when a Black, queer, thick artist woman intentionally takes up space, it creates a new world. And then in the next section, she says, I read sci-fi and visionary fiction as political, sacred, and philosophical text, and I engage with others who read it that way. I spent the first part of my life learning what history's victors wanted to tell me to believe about the past, including the simple assumption that it was the past. I see massive patterns of violence and inequality in history, which perpetuate in the daily news. Science fiction, particularly visionary fiction, is where I go to when I need the medicine of possibility applied to the trauma of human behavior. Um, so, in that quote, I think I feel Adrienne sort of wrestling with this tension between art and activism. And I know she also often talks about sort of what Octavia, I think, calls being a hobby scientist, which I know you talk about often also. And Kendra Kruger also calls that citizen science. She does a lot of like help sort of engaging the public in citizen science. And I'm one of the first questions I often ask is like, what tensions do you feel like you're holding in your life right now? But I feel like maybe the way I want to phrase it for you is like, do you often feel tensions between art and science and um, I think activism as well, and like how you work, how you maybe work those out for yourself?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I think, and I love that quote, by the way, also. Thanks for reading that. It's a nice one to return to. As you said, she has so many great quotes, and I was not expecting that one. So that's cool to
Mm-hmm.
be reminded of the significance of those words right now. Yeah, I think that there is just an abundance of tension, and I've felt that tension through my entire career and probably all the way through school, even as young as a child as well. Being really, really basic and not nuanced at all, there is not a ton of overlap that I've experienced, whereas I can like walk into an art space as this identity and just talk about the sciences that make me very excited, or
Mm-hmm.
walk into a science space as this identity and talk about the arts that make me really excited. So just on that basic principle alone, there have been big waves of my life where I've leaned into one discipline or the other
Mm-hmm.
to avoid that friction, because I think it's an amplified friction as a Black woman, because I think that if you and I know I have friends of this sort of discipline as well. If you were like a white man stepping into a science space and talking about art, you might also be seen as really, you know, profound in lots of ways, you know.
Totally. Yeah.
Or if you're a white man walking into an art space offering all of this science, you might also be seen as somebody coming to this with a really unique positionality. But for
Right.
me, as a
Innovative
person,
or
totally. But
yeah.
as a person who is already in an identity bracket that is less likely to be believed, in my experience, you know, there is this friction of like pulling from one space and trying to, you know, negotiate it in another. So I think that is like ever present all the time. And really, um, I'm sure there are many tiny ways in which I've tried to negotiate that within myself to be more like comfortable holding that tension, or to be more comfortable like occupying space in that tension.
Mm-hmm.
One of the really significant ways I've done it is just by the nature of finding other people who are trying to like wriggle their way in, and then forming like even just a mental community of people who are like, occupying this space.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that I've been really lucky to find people, but also there have been ways where I've been unlucky, and in my head I have formed this like tiny little ecosystem, like you're not doing this alone, like so and so you've never met is also doing this, and this person over in this country who you've never met is also doing this. It's like a way of cognitively permitting yourself to be in that space with more confidence. But it is yeah, it's something only in the last 4 or 5 years that I think I've really reveled in, so much as like, started to abandon some of the anxiety that comes with it, and starting to just like decide that this is what makes my work really special.
Yeah.
And that, if people don't want to be a part of that, then they don't have to. Nobody's forcing anybody to come to anything,
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
you don't have to get it, and it's okay if you don't get it. It's just not
yeah.
for you, really.
And then like one other quote from Adrienne Marie Brown that really helped me reframe things too. I'm looking at the book right now. She has like a compilation work of Octavia's, ruminations on Octavia's work called Octavia's Brood. I'm sure you've heard of it. And in that book, she has a quote that I'm not going to paraphrase super well, but it's around the scope of any act of community activism is an act of science fiction, because it requires you to imagine things you've not yet seen and decide that they're worth pursuing.
Yeah.
And that to me has been so inspiring, because I'm like, wow, like just in that one phrase, like here are all these webs between activism and art and tech and science and technology sort of like smushed together with purpose,
Yeah. I was going to say too that, I mean, I think that's one reason why folks like Octavia and Grace Lee Boggs and Ursula K. Le Guin, like all these folks who came before us, also sort of form that network of like, oh, I'm not the first, and also there are other people doing this thing. And even if you can't find local community, that like we have people that have come before us in a lineage of sci-fi writers or activists that have been talking about mashing those things together for a long time. And I think you talk about, here comes my cat.
I'm sure mine will make an appearance at some point too.
Yeah. Where was I going with that? Thanks, Simon. Totally lost my train of thought.
You were saying that there's people who've come before us and that I talk about, and then we.
Oh yeah. I think also just that like Octavia is one great example too of that sort of citizen science, right? That like and or hobby scientist, as she calls herself, I think, that like I think often as a person who writes and does art and like sort of more recently got into science, that I always felt sort of like a fraud, going into science spaces. But I think there's so much around that, not just with like experience, but also class and race and, 100 other identity things that like not everyone gets access to scientific spaces or to academia or whatever. And so sometimes like the power in just sort of claiming a space for yourself and going, no, I get to claim myself as a scientist in this way, because what am I doing other than experimenting and, like scientists do, which is imagining alternatives for a future or explanations for the universe that require a great deal of creativity. And when you don't have access to certain things, you sort of have to access your creativity in that way. You're like, I'm going to work with what I've got. So here we are.
No, I completely agree. And also, one of the things that's that really needs to be dismantled in the sciences is how people are, stamped with this like unmarkable like approval to engage with sciences, and I think that I think access is a really important part of that conversation. I also think like folding in the conversation of what is true or not is a really important part of that conversation. In the class that I'm teaching at the SFPC, we're reading right now Robin Wall Kimmerer's Braiding Sweetgrass. And
well, there's my cat, but also Robin, the Braiding Sweetgrass is right there.
Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah, I have it right here too. And we just got to this chapter called A Council of Pecans. Pecan, Pecan, wherever
Yeah,
wherever
depending
you
on
are
where
in the
you're
world.
from.
I flip-flop, being a person who has like multiple accents in my immediate family.
Yeah.
Anyways, inside of this chapter, you know, Robin talks about this scientific history of the pecan tree and the ways in which it is like mapped across like a span of space, and in that mapping is totally omitting the people who carried these nuts as they were being basically upheaved from indigenous people being upheaved from one location to another, and like, you know, using this nut as food and dropping nuts or planting nuts along the way that becomes this tree line. And so, you know, we've been talking in this class about how we would center cultural truths and personal truths in alignment with scientific truths. And I think one of the reasons why it's really hard for people like me to just step into the sciences and be seen with respect is because I think I am bringing with me, as well as many other people like myself are bringing with me, cultural truths and personal truths to hold in the same respect as the scientific truths, because I really do believe that like sciences have been you know, intentionally omitting all kinds of sociological histories and you know, race and gender based histories that contribute to their like plant matter that they're researching, or the like, you know, ecological structure that they're researching. And that's not a super welcomed because it challenges the like highest form of truth. It's not a super welcome philosophy to bring into science unless you find the right science community, you know.
Totally. Is an unplanned sort of tangent, but I was just also thinking like it's just such an interesting time also to have that conversation now too. And this is like not commentary one way or another, but the way that we're talking about science right now because of the pandemic, as in like believe science, science is the truth, this like ultimate reality sort of thing, is so fascinating. Um, when and where, like, how did you get into all of this work in the first place? Where did you come to this? Did you just like stumble across a book that changed your world, or what's the story?
It's a good question. I wish I had like a better memory of it all. It feels like it's just been so uh both like fictitious and fluid. So in and people ask me this question a lot, and I feel like I tell a different story every time, and I feel like all those stories are true. but
Yeah.
but yeah, maybe just like all happened in tandem somehow. But basically my answer to it is that, you know, in as a child, I was really, really into science and super into biology, especially. And that really got stamped out of me in high school. I was like not the prime candidate for who they wanted to see in the sciences. I didn't ask the right questions. And by that, I mean, I think I was asking really good questions, but they weren't welcome to the textbook of like knowledge that we had to uphold. And so, you know, I wasn't really welcomed in this. I didn't feel internally as like, you know, a kid that did really well in school, like was not feeling like welcomed into the sciences. And was always super welcomed into the arts. But, you know, I think that I was sort of destined to come back to science in some way, because I feel like if you're curious, if your curiosity existed as a kid, you will one day find yourself back in that world, you know, with great joy, I would say. So anyways, I think in my career, like coming out of high school, decided to go into a new media art background, which is like technology and art. And that felt really cool to me. It was a super shocking surprise that required me to learn to code. That's how I made my first friend, is that I was like crying in the bathroom as we were like went on break between our first coding lesson. And then like a friend of mine.
With that well.
Yeah. And then I ended up loving it. And so this is like the crazy part about it, is that through code, I started to love like speed and gravity and slope and like some of the other sciences that I had been omitted from. And so it started to open my eyes a little bit about the idea that like, oh, maybe there are pockets of science that are for me. I hadn't like quite made my way back to biology yet, but those things show up in biology too. And so through code, I was like building little robotic structures running across the floor and like really into the like calculations that came with that. And that's one of the ways that I came back to math too, because I hated math prior to that. But yeah, started working in activism oriented technology spaces. So like ran a girls coding program for a while, and then ran like quite a number of guerrilla style technology programs for Black youth, and then specifically Black female youth. And, you know, the list kind of goes on in that way. Like went to, like got a lot of funding from Google and went to Johannesburg and had all these great experiences that were like very, very strictly like technology, art, and activism. But at the same time, I was very stressed. It's like full pedal on the gas. And something that had always brought me a lot of comfort was baking. So I signed up for these baking courses at the local college, and then ended up completing a diploma like in baking with a specialization in fermentation, which I decided was super cool because it let you talk about molecules and bacteria, and all of a sudden you're talking about these little creatures that you couldn't see without a microscope. And it felt so scientific. And so that through food is the way that like my world came back to science. And truly, and this is like the fun part of the story, is that truly these things would have continued to stay disparate unless, like if I hadn't have gone to this one workshop at Interaccess. There's this instructor there, her name is Sarah, she's like fabulous. She was teaching a slime mold workshop, and slime mold had a lot of properties to the kind of like sourdough activity. So I was like curious about it. It was in this like art gallery that I was familiar with, so it felt very safe. And like she handed me
slime mold's formation is similar to the way sourdough structures happen
ish, but mostly that the movement, the like patterns of movement were similar to my knowledge at the time. I was like new to slime mold, but the way it was described, I was like, oh, it sounds like these cells physically move in a way that's similar to the way that like lactobacteria moves in sourdough. So that was like where my head was at, and was just curious. And I was a big fan of this new media art gallery, having like come from technology arts. In our introductions in this workshop, offhand, I was like, yeah, I mean, I'm really into science, sort of because of food, but I really love science fiction. I don't know what I'm doing. I don't even know why I'm telling you all this, but I'm really, these are some of the disconnected things I'm really interested in.
It's and actually perfect because I'm well, go ahead. I'll let you finish.
Well, the instructor handed me this article by Amy Lee Bang, and it was like an article that talked about Octavia Butler being a hobby scientist studying slime mold. And it was the first time that like all of these worlds had come together for me. And so like if I hadn't gone to that workshop, I think it would have taken me ages to get to this place, because I just had never come across the information in all the years of studying Octavia Butler and reading her work. I'd never come across the information that she was into looking at things under a microscope to inspire her artistic work. And so it was like a real like synergistic moment where everything sort of aligned. And then it was just a matter of like feeling out who else cared about this stuff, you know?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
I was going to ask actually at the beginning, do you know who Asia Dorsey is?
Yes. Yeah.
So Asia was my fermentation mentor. I actually worked one-on-one with Asia for a bit of time while she was still running 5 Points Fermentation here in Denver. And so I mean, I've been into food for a really long time, but fermentation just was like an instantly mystical art also that was like, hold on, cat man. That was like, it was scientific, but it was also spiritual and mystical, and that, you know, like when you can't see certain things that are happening behind the scenes, and they're doing this transformation work that like is out of your control really, but you're like collaborating with this unseen force sort of to create, you know, like you combine a couple things together and they become something else entirely. Like there's just there's so much metaphor, I think, in crossover in fermentation that has never not been a source of like writing and like inspiration and all kinds of things for me. So that makes so much sense.
Yeah, totally. I'm not sure if you're familiar with like the work of Alex Ketchum or Maya Hayes, but they literally have written work that is entitled like Fermentation as Metaphor, and talk about the agents of change.
Sandor Katz.
As well as Sandor Katz. Sandor Katz has the same sort of like subject matter. And you know, Canadian reference, Lorraine Fournier as well, talks about fermenting feminism, and just talking about the like agitation of agents of change that are bacterial, and like what we can learn about that to pursue feminist revolution. And it was a big inspiration for me. It's like part of I've been running these fermenting a revolution workshops for a while, and they also try to explore how does this unseen structure that seems to have a lot of like ebbs and flow and like collaboration, if you will, like allow it to personify it. How can we scrape that and learn from that in order to pursue a little bit more social justice for ourselves?
Yeah. So, okay. So talk to me more about slime mold first also.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it seems like once you found out about that at that workshop, you got really into the idea of slime mold. Like, what is it
Yeah.
about slime mold that's super inspiring to you?
Yeah, it's hard to know where to start because aesthetically it is so alarming as something that exists in nature. It comes in so many colors, but a very common version that is studied in labs and in art practices is neon yellow. Like, just imagine dystopian like creature from the lagoon yellow.
Yeah.
And so, alone there's a curiosity in me that's like it's drawn to it just by the fact that it's supposed to be this ecological decomposer, and yet like how are you operating in the forests with this extraordinary vibrancy?
Yeah, like you're not hiding at all, like most
No.
creatures in the forest. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think that's really, one thing that drew me to it initially, but also I think its history is really interesting. It's had so many waves of popularity, which means it's had like peaks and valleys of funding. It's like fallen off the popularity train and then come back. And the reason why is because there's a little bit of mysticism around it. The categorizations that have followed it, it's a fungi, it's a mold, have been debunked like decade after decade after decade. It still fits oddly on the animal kingdom. And I think it's really curious that a lot of people who are Black start to talk about the waves of like Black popular culture and falling off the popularity chain and like waves of funding and then like being like sort of like omitted from popular discourse. And so that is kind of like a cool combination of worlds and discussion. But as a species, as an organism, it is fascinating because it has hundreds of expressions of gender or sexuality. It's got a distributed method of nutrients. So it's unlike most creatures where the cells that are fastest and strongest and arrive at the food first get to feed first in order to continue its ability to thrive. The fastest, strongest cells eat last in these slime mold structures. They like send nutrients down the pipeline, down to the back to feed all of the cells that are weakest, which I think is really cool. And its ability to have no centralized brain, but still have predictive properties. It has like memory retention in a lot of ways. Catherine Barnett talks a lot about these studies that were done where like a petri dish underneath a fan that went off at like 3 p.m. every day, but not on the last day. And the slime mold still reacted and like retracted away from the dehydrating fan. So it has this ability to like hold on to information, even though it has no centralized brain, which is, I think, why a lot of technological labs are trying to use it to map out like most efficient subway patterns like they did in Japan, or solving maps, and comparing that to the ways in which computational algorithms and AI can perform. And so it's really cool to me that there's like this creature, no brain, like no consistent information necessarily about where it lives on the animal kingdom, has all of this inherent wisdom around things that we just as humans socially can't figure out, or as humans technologically are still trying to puzzle through. So it's a fascinating organism to me.
Yeah. Again, like there's so much metaphor there. You could just go on forever. I've heard you sort of talk about how living organisms can teach us empathy.
Yeah.
And I think there were several things in that where you mentioned stuff that was really like, I mean, the empathy even of, like you said, sort of moving nutrients back to the pieces of the organism that don't have the thing, or, have as much resources. And then, I was gonna, oh my God, I'm so sorry.
It's okay. No problem.
Technology
Take your
interruptions
time.
are totally messing with my brain. Pecans. I was going to go back to that. Okay. I'm just going to have you talk about empathy and I'll come back to the other part. I'm sure it's going to come up.
Yeah, no problem. I mean, I think that there's a lot about slime mold that can help us learn how to be more empathetic with one another. I think there's like a tongue-in-cheek way of approaching this, that if this, I I hold quite a lot of respect for slime mold, but if this organism can figure out distributed nutrients,
Surely we can.
surely we can figure it out. It can't be rocket science. I mean, this organism holds like so much information, so like maybe it's just like heads and tails above what we're possible of conceiving, but come on, right? And so, you know, it's at the core, empathy especially, and what we can learn from slime mold about empathy is at the core of the work that I have as a collaborator with both slime mold and an artist named Ayo Consciende. We have a project called the Slime Tech Lab. It's literally a mobile lab. There's a Google interview coming out about it in a little bit. And essentially, this is something we like rove around New York, mostly for communities of color, to talk via slime mold as like an agent for conversation, to talk about challenging subject matter like immigration and, you know, moving across great distances, because slime mold does have this like, you know, ability to have like a really interesting pattern of movement. Or like mutual aids and like new networks of food distribution. And so what we've learned in that process, this is a hunch we had, but has been proven pretty much time and time again, is that if we were to have these conversations without slime mold, I think we would have success, but it would take a while to get people comfortable. But because we have this conversation in collaboration with and centering slime mold, people have this instinct to feel something for it. It's small, it's interesting, it's made up of all of these cells. These cells are doing things that are nuanced and just like outside of the realm of what we imagine. This living thing has an extension of empathy that makes the conversations a lot deeper, a lot faster, a lot more compelling, and people share in more vulnerable ways. And so that is something that I think is not directly tied to what we can learn from slime mold, but certainly fascinating in the way that we have hard conversations, you know?
Yeah. And there's a couple things in there where, that came up for me. And one of them is that like, I've heard in science fiction, like it works really well. Like part of the point of science fiction is to like help us imagine new futures, right? So like something that hasn't yet existed, we're imagining how it might exist in the future. And I know you talk about a lot of that with like how I think it's like 87% of our technology or something was actually originally imagined inside of science fiction.
That's right.
And which is a fascinating stat. I want to know more about that. But I think that one of the things I've heard about science fiction is that like it's like you have to have just enough of some sort of existing reality so that people have a grounding to it to like really be able to understand, so that you're mixing both like a vision for the future, but also enough of what someone can grasp as like real, so that they're not completely ungrounded. And I think there's something about what you're saying is that like, you know, it might take you a lot longer to get people comfortable with the idea of mutual aid or these other metaphors and ways that slime mold teaches us how we can be. If you didn't have slime mold as an example, but like actually grounding something in a present reality, even though it's like a very, like use a sort of bizarre organism, right? It's like neon or whatever. It's still something that I think ties us close enough to our present day world, but goes like, something is giving us enough of both this world, but also what the future world can hold. That it becomes like more real for people.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's an interesting kind of summary of that. I want to agree. I think that, I mean, it's a bit of a surprise to me, because when we're talking about immigration and we're talking about mutual aid or mutual care as well, we are talking about it from the human context. So you'd think that a group of humans could find some kind of way to tap in to that really quick. But I think getting a glimpse of a networked object that thinks, I'm sort of like using like air quotes because it's like that's a human phenomenon, right? That performs in ways that are unlike and more progressive, if you will, than the way that we perform. It does give us a glimpse as to what the future or even the tandem timelines could be, right? This organism isn't something from space. It's happening right around us. It's like probably, you know, hanging out in the forest nearby my house. And so I think that there's like this cool thing about seeing something act in ways that are more progressive than us in real time, in tandem to our timeline, that is totally like a little, almost like a little petri dish portal into the future of what we could be as a society, you know? So it is special that it's not completely imagined, that it is real, and it is special that it's something we haven't tapped into as a human race right now.
Yeah, it's hard. I'm sort of with you, and like I have a hesitation around like sort of fully getting on board with that idea, only because like, you know, you actually have a quote. Hold on, I'm gonna pull it in from one of your talks. That is, hold on, let me find it. The idea of what we're engaging with right now can't be limited by what we think is possible logistically. And I think that's the sort of beauty of science fiction. And I think also like Black liberation and Black solidarity and people of color that like for so long have been like, we don't have a sense of reality right now that looks anything like what we want the future to look like. So I don't want to sort of be tied to something that would ground me into present day reality, because it doesn't really serve me.
So present day, go ahead.
Yeah, no, that was really it. Just sort of riffing on that, but
and the present day reality is also a biased narrative all on its own, right? I mean, like major narrative is not a narrative written by me, major media narrative, like all of these things are like, that's why it's really important, I think, for people who are like Black or female or like queer or trans, is to like find that pathway of narrative that is for you, that is by you as well, right? That is by people who are connected to what you believe in and who you are, because it also helps you like tap out of all of the like dismay and like just stereotyping cloaked rhetoric of major narratives. Those things are in a lot of ways like a part of the reality that we live, but it's also not the full definition of who we are. And so, you know, there has to be some kind of combination. Otherwise, it is to the great benefit of colonized based structures or colonizers as well, that we feel dismayed by the situation that we live in, because then we'll never have the like gumption or energy to, you know, act and form and create traction for the things that we really want, right? So it has to be sort of like a combination, but you have to be able to tap in and hear the things that are about you, for you, and in favor of you, and excited about your existence too, right?
Yeah, totally. And that's why I think the like sort of political sort of saying or whatever, that's like, you know, that's why when in times of dystopian whatever or dictatorship, that they come for art first, because the first thing they want is to remove your imagination, because if you can't imagine a different world, then you're not going to fight for it.
Absolutely. And that's, you know, I'm so glad you brought that up, because absolutely, and it's definitely, it's like going back to this pecan tree chapter, is like taking away, you know, talking about the indigenous communities that were like moved from like Oklahoma and moved from Texas, and just like kept being upheaved in like horrific ways in the name of trying to like get all of the children into these residential schools. You know, there was no song allowed, no dance allowed. All of the arts were ways of like channeling that like internal tenacity, that internal spirit, and those were of course the first to go. It's a American and Canadian timeline, you know.
You also mentioned at some point in sort of describing slime mold, centering slime mold. And I know you talk about decentering humans in your conversations. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, you know, I think this comes up a lot in our classes as well, like the classes that we teach for the Slime Tech Lab and for the School for Poetic Computation, really anywhere. I think that there's like a reality check we kind of need as a human race to pull ourselves out, even just for 10 minutes, of the major narrative of how we're envisioning change, futures, existences. You know, I think that a lot of science fiction does talk about and does show us, you know, the incredible flaws of humans that don't let us make it off the ship or don't let us make it off the planet, but like all these other species do. And I think that's kind of like a fun part about science fiction that is like, you know, a great point of reflection. I think in practice right now, I think that there is an extraordinary amount of learning that can come in getting out of the way of the wisdom that other species and other creatures have to show us. And also centering ourselves at the middle of the narrative, the middle of like every point of like opportunity to learn, it prioritizes like the way that we think specifically, the way that we communicate specifically, the way that we like house and hold ourselves specifically. And I think that means that like, you know, we miss out on all of the really beautiful nuance that other species hold in the way that they engage with one another. And so it's also just like we've centered humans so far, and look at our survival, you know, again, in air quotes.
Yeah.
Maybe it's time for a different model of considering how we like bring other species up to the same sort of importance that we hold for ourselves. Like, you know, I think that there is an argument that like all these species have just as much reason to be here as we do. And so, yeah, I think there's the slightly more human-centered way of saying like, we should learn from these other creatures so that we can be better. But also like, you know, we're reaching a brink of climate change. That means that we're going to be creating great peril for a lot of other species. And so we need to start making some space for them to hold similar kinds of significance in the way that we organize, make policy, et cetera, et cetera.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And yeah, let's go back to immigration, because I don't want to sort of finish with slime mold before we talk about immigration. Like, what are the overlaps there? Because we didn't really go into that.
Yeah. So there are so many beautiful pieces of art that have created agar landscapes. Agar is this like nutrient substrate that usually sits at the bottom of a petri dish for you to add your organism onto so that it stays hydrated and stays healthy. There are lots of artists who have been making these really elaborate petri dishes, if you will, that have like topographical landscape that is like raised and has valleys, and the whole purpose is to recreate the kind of like patterns of people's movement from one space to another, especially people in turmoil. Like, you know, there's a lot of work around the like Mexico-US border that's been built into agar petri dishes and then inoculated with like food sources for slime mold, and then you know, observed as slime mold makes that journey across that like mini mountain range. And you know, that conversation once again opens up all of this beautiful nuance and comfortability with talking about immigration, because we're watching like all these like poor little creatures go across this terrain to get to from one end to the other. And then as we start to feel empathy for that little creature, we start to extend that empathy out to the people who have to make that journey in like, you know, great distress, to put it really, really lightly. And so yeah, I think that they're like, you know, in following that, my collaborators and I have really worked with slime mold to talk about like movement patterns and like, you know, as people move and immigrate from one place to another, like how do you seek food, and like where are you getting your resources, and how these things are also predictable by modern technology and algorithms that can, you know, try to determine where people will be in order to remove resources. And so yeah, I think that there's the idea that we can see a creature make decisions that might mimic the decisions that we make, I think creates all of this really interesting discussion around like how we preserve the possibility for people to get from one place to another safely. Yeah.
Yeah. I was going to say, I just remember too what I was going to say earlier, which is like, it makes so much sense to me that slime mold is an organism that sort of refuses to be categorized.
Yeah.
It is sort of by nature a this plus that organism, you know. It's,
totally.
Yeah, both animal and fungi and
Yeah.
all the above, you know, which I, like you were saying, it just makes, it says so much for the way that we hold empathy around talking about gender or like expression in any shape or form. And I think identity across the board, not just gender and sexuality, but being able to go like, what is it to like, how about we sit first of all with our uncomfortable, like our discomfort, I guess, in what it means to see an organism reflect to us something about being fully both or fully more than one thing. So not, you know, not just one or the other, or neutralized even. Like Asia Dorsey talks about this a lot, that often in culture, what we're trying to do or what ends up in mainstream is sort of trying to neutralize what happens. So in gender conversations, that it's not, male and female and X, Y, and Z. It's, androgyny or,
Yeah,
something that's
right.
like in the middle or whatever. And instead goes, what is it to be fully both
Yes,
masculine and feminine and,
right.
the whole spectrum?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think there is just a lot in slime mold that demonstrates that possibility. I think in biological ways that we would have a hard time mimicking fully, but
Yeah.
because like all of those cells are, it's almost as if they could do whatever they want. um, but but yeah, I think that that's one of the exciting things around it too. Is also in learning about this through the sciences, in learning about this organism and building respect for its properties, it makes sense to start to build more respect for similar properties in human beings as well, right? If we can
Yeah.
feel in awe about all of the ways in which slime mold expresses sexuality, then like, we're a little bit closer to feeling like appreciation and awe and like acceptance for all of the ways in which human beings express sexuality as well, right? And
Yeah.
so it's just like walking a little bit closer, but it is always kind of funny to me that this faceless creature has this capacity to build all of this empathy for us, because for a long time, there was a lot of studies that really talked about how for us to feel empathetic to the struggle or the lifestyle of a creature, they have to exhibit some of the features that we have.
Mm.
And I've just like not seen that to be very true in all of the ways that we've been working with slime mold, which couldn't be
Mm.
physiologically more different than us,
We are not neon yellow, as it
No, I
turns out.
wish. Imagine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If only, maybe one day.
Yeah.
Um, I love also the idea of predictability because I think you use AI and technology in that way
Yeah.
also. Like I loved, is it Opening the Portal, your project where you
Right.
talk about sort of feeding in text from Black and, BIPOC folks,
Yeah.
and the machine itself sort of spits out ideas for new futures based on
Right.
what's been inserted. Is that right?
Yeah. This is a project that Culture Hub helped me get started, and it's like a prophecy machine, like something that is telling you the thesis statement, if you will, of like many sci-fi books. And the it's based off of an AI model. And so a machine learning model. And so this machine learning model was initially fed, like I fed it pure canon. And if you're looking at science fiction canon, it's like almost 100% white and male. And so
Yeah.
so like by
Funny,
convention,
but not funny.
right. Yeah, exactly. Like surprise, surprise.
Yeah.
But by convention, that would mean that all of the predictions of the future, these prophecies from the future, are written with the intention of like continuing the white male narrative. Like it really is written and designed by white males
Right.
talking about this. So the objective is really to hold workshops, and I've been holding these workshops to write science fiction with Black and brown and people of color, Indigenous people of color, and feed those stories into the machine learning models, that over time, the prophecies from the future that we get are like closer to what a prophecy would be if it was like written for us and by us. And so just watching that shift over time has been really interesting. And so it's also been a great way to connect with other science fiction writers of color as I build out my own like micro library of published work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Yeah.
I also love, sounds like sort of a similar project, the Investing in Futures Beyond Policing that happened after the murder of George Floyd and Breonna
Yeah.
Taylor. And just the point you made, which is about, I think in a talk when you were discussing it, you were saying that like the folks in that came up with more than 50 models of how life would look like without
Right.
policing. And it's so interesting to me because I think, one of my last conversations was with someone, Deacon Rada, on economics and design. And so often when we're talking about economics, everyone only has like, oh, it's only either capitalism or socialism. And I think
Mm-hmm.
similarly in policing, it's like, well, what would we do without that? Like
Yeah.
who would I call if something went wrong? And
Right.
the idea that like one small group of people, I mean, it was a large group of people, it sounds like,
Mm-hmm.
but in
Mm-hmm.
general, like relatively, it's a small group of people
Relatively.
came up with at least 50
Yeah.
ideas for what community could look like without police. And that's so fascinating. And the idea of, I think, integrating AI with that is so fascinating to me. I think I tend to be
Yeah.
sort of I don't know if Luddite is the right word, but I'm sort of future technology adverse possibly.
Mhm.
Mostly because I think the way that it's often talked about is usually in the hands of white men, or like sort of for
Totally.
things that I feel like are for profit, or sort of a future I
Yep.
just like don't really have an interest in.
Yep.
And so the idea that we might actually be able to use AI and technology for that kind of good, and like imagining stuff beyond even what we can do at a human capacity in our brains is so fascinating.
Yeah. Well, yeah, thanks for that great overview. That great description of investing in futures. It is a bit, I feel of both minds that it is a bit unbelievable that we created all of these worlds, but also it is super believable because a lot of the principles that went into designing these worlds are based on things that people are already doing, and so that investing in futures beyond policing was like such a beautiful effort. um, Myself and Netta Bomani um, really kind of like spearheaded it, but there was like just so many incredible collaborators, and just, Lydia Jessup and Marina Zerkow and Sarah Rothberg, and just so many people, Kadra Mensa. Anyways, just like a huge team of people just on the fly coming together to decide that there was this tiny crack in the wall of funded police, and there was this small opportunity to have meaningful discourse around how our societies would look with if we defunded police. What would we do? And so, it's just like the speculative designer in me is like, oh my gosh, like if people of color don't come to some point, like if we don't come into the conversation and say, well, this is what we need instead, this is what we want instead, we'll just get a different version of police. That's what's happened. Police are recreations of like slave patrol, like recreations of like all kinds of like, often like Black and Indigenous, punitive measures that have existed throughout history. Like it will just get spewed out in another way that's like community officer or some kind of nonsense like that. It's like
Right.
still the same thing.
Prison will look like prison in another way. Yeah.
Exactly. And so, those conversations, we ran them for nearly a year. Each session, there were 4 worlds built, and all of these wonderful people like Fred Moten and Ruha Benjamin jumped in to help us like imagine these things together. And so the cool thing about those conversations that people were given like real world stakes, but also the opportunity to imagine things that were like incredibly impossible, like completely speculative, and then draw back, okay, well, what are the features that we could slowly walk towards now, or super realistic. And in the small breakout rooms, people were just talking about the incredible, brave, super tangible ways that their individual community was operating in measures of care. And so those got extrapolated out into like systems that could be applied to a whole community.
Right. They were emergent, as you might
They
say.
totally. Exactly. And so that, I think, plus like a little bit of humor here, a little bit of imagination here, a little bit of like texture and visuals, I think it left everybody feeling very inspired to start to think about how, if the ultimate goal is a world we live in without police, and they're fathomed upon like small things that we're doing as a community, let's keep walking backwards so that we can walk slowly towards those worlds. So what are the tiny things we can do now? What are the ways that we can bridge with other communities to make those tiny things a little bit bigger? What are the ways that we can like exactly, which is like right back to slime mold, right? These like kind of fractal nodal points of information and behavioral patterns. So that project probably stands to be one of the most meaningful that I feel like I've ever participated in, because we ended up engaging with over like 500 people, most of which were strangers. 99% were Black people in this moment where it felt like all we could really do is engage. You had no other choice. It's happening right around you. It's not hypothetical. It's reality right now. And it's cool to match reality that's heavy and dark and burdensome with imaginative play for purpose.
Yeah, totally. And actually, speaking of like emergent strategy and like fractal behavior, I was going to ask, like, is slime mold actually, have you seen it work at scale? Like, does it actually grow fairly large? Like mycelia? Like, have we seen it actually sort of model for us what it might be to do, smaller behaviors like that sort of mutual aid, but then like grow itself out to larger community?
Yeah, I mean, mycelium certainly has, in my research, a greater capacity to cross huge distances. And I think that's mostly because it's subterranean. So people have found mycelial networks that are just like kilometers,
Right.
making my Canadianness known right now, miles, whatever, whatever,
Whole
kilometers
continents
or
large, basically.
yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Because there is a way to do that and experience slightly less human obstruction, right?
Yeah.
But slime mold reaching such extraordinary distances, I mean, it will be obstructed by like roads or sidewalks or things like that, just human interference,
Yeah.
being stepped on maybe. And so, or just animal interference. So I
Right.
haven't seen like, I'm sure the research is out there. It's a question I haven't like pursued super deeply, but I know that some of the limitations are that like there is just so much that we've done to disrupt forests that make it hard for these things to grow above ground
Yeah.
so far. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I also like, I, I don't know, this is just me sort of riffing and also my own sort of experience of this. Like, I think part of my question, my sort of active question that I live with is like, is scale actually necessary? Like,
Yeah.
have we actually grown beyond scale? Should we
Right.
actually sort of go back to smaller scale? And is that part of what would make us more sustainable?
Yeah.
So maybe in that way, slime mold actually does teach us something about what it means to, do mutual
Right.
aid and all those other practices in a sustainable way.
Right. Well, if we're referencing, historical cultures that have operated in tribes and operated in like small communities, I mean, scale hasn't always been necessary. I have a friend and colleague, Netta Bumani, who talks all the time about how scale is connected to capitalist intentions. Like, why do we want to scale? Is it for
Right.
dominance? Is it for ego? Is it for like, maximizing the resources in ways beyond our means? Like, what does it mean to scale? And I think those are really great questions. And I see less functionable, I see less functioning like networks that are huge than I do networks that are small,
Yeah.
And I think like the smallness of it, the unscaled versions also let you deepen your relationship to the individual, like who they are, what their needs are, how those needs can be met.
Yep.
This is the like know your neighbor ethos that like I've seen most dramatically functionable in Bed-Stuy, for instance. Is like just this like tiny pocket network of care that edges up against another tiny pocket network of care, and that's how these communities really continue to thrive.
Yeah. Bed-Stuy in New York. Yeah.
Yeah, Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn, yeah, in New
Yeah.
York.
Yeah. Okay. I genuinely could probably talk to you for like 3 hours. So I've got like 800 notes. Um, I want to make sure though that we like really discuss anything that you would feel like we might miss out on. So like anything from like Black solidarity to I really also want to know about beekeeping, a techno theory.
Yeah,
It's like a
right.
tangent, but that sounds amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah, Afrofuturism, bio art, like I think in general, like how art, we've sort
Yeah.
of covered how art plays a role, but yeah,
It's a lot to cover. There's a lot to cover.
yeah, I was gonna ask like why we need Black queer women to
Yeah.
get into science fiction also.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, yes. So I get this question a lot, and I also ask this question a lot, and I hate and love this question because this is like it. I think the reason why I hate it is because it pulls up a little post-traumatic stress from being like, there was a chapter in my life where I was just, advocating for diversity in tech, and I got the question all the time, like, well, why should Black people be in technology? And I felt like it was just such an like the question was, oh my God, it was such an like, what could we possibly offer that we don't already have at the heart of white male technology? And so yeah, so I feel like that there's like a little bit of like, skin goes up from the memories of having to answer like, well, Black people exist and they have things to add, and there's like nuance and wisdom and skill and all kinds of things there. But in this particular context, I feel like there's a different answer in a lot of ways, because I think that Black queer women in science fiction, I mean, I think one way to answer that is to just look at the impact of people of that demographic already, like the ways in which Octavia Butler has really transformed much of our conversation, especially in the pandemic. It's like funny to see that a lot of us were looking at Octavia Butler like well before the pandemic, and then the pandemic hit and everybody's reading Octavia Butler and everybody's talking about Octavia Butler's work as like ways to puzzle our way through this, especially books like Clay's Arc, which is about a virus, and especially in the like weird ways in which, you know, Trump was like "Make America Great Again," which is a phrase of like a major character in Octavia Butler. My friend and I were just laughing about this the other day, like how funny it would be if like closeted and secretively Trump was like an Octavia Butler hyper fan, but was like, I just can't ever let anybody know about that. And then one day he accidentally let it slip, like "Make America Great Again." All Black people were like, hmm? And he was like, "Nothing. It's just I made it up. It's fine." Like hides a curtain of all his Octavia Butler originals. Anyways, maybe
I mean, it would not be unlike white culture to steal Black culture for
100%. Yeah,
so
100%.
Like even if it's not, he's not a fan, the idea that even one of his like aides or someone who writes his speeches or, you know, whoever his PR team is who's coming up with his slogans was like, that's a good line.
Yeah, that was a good one. I'll keep that one. Yeah, totally. All of that feels very plausible. Yeah, I think that the whole topic about like why Black women and Black queer women should be at the center of science fiction, and it's tied to both that study that a huge proportion of our technology is based off of science fiction, and so we should have people with identities that are intersectional, like really writing the things that become mainstream devices that we use.
Yeah.
But also, like, I think that there's like a real like multifaceted lens that I think Black queer like feminists can provide, because they feel the marginalization and oppression in so many different directions. And so I think that there's like, you know, not to put them on too much of a platform, but I do think that there is a lived experience that could edge up against a lot of people and help a lot of people, because it does like cross paths with so many different like individual identities, you know.
Yeah.
It's a burden for a lot of people, but
yeah.
if we reframe the way that we think about people with deeper lived experiences, it could also be such an incredible gift to our framing of thinking.
Yeah, and I think it's like I hear the way you're I hear the way you're hearing it. I think the way I was thinking about it was less from the framework of like, why should white wealthy, you know, like men, whatever, like the sort of opposite end of the spectrum of those three things, you know,
yeah,
like why should they have, you know, us in their science fiction, and more, why should we want to, you know, like I think I'm thinking it more like what, yeah, like why, why should Black queer feminists, you know, like actually get into science fiction? Like why science fiction even, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question too. I don't know. I mean, I don't know that I know the answer. I think that for me, I'm like, you know, I want Black queer women to do whatever they want. Like, but it's like that, you know, that kind of like viral meme. It's like, I support women's rights and I also support women's wrongs. I like do whatever you want, really, because I think that for, you know, a long time, I was also pushing this whole like Black people need to get into technology. Oh, my cat. Yeah, but I also feel like, you know, the most optimal world for me is a place where like Black queer women are doing exactly what they want to do without being told that they have to do that because that's the most like obvious, or that we desperately need them to do that to like save us, or
that's where the burden comes from.
Yeah, or that, you know, this is the only place where they're welcomed. I feel like the topia, I guess, not specifically dystopian or utopian, the like place I would like to live is like, if they're into it, then they should come on board. And if they're not, go do the other thing that you're really into, because there are just so many barriers to like letting people do what they want to do, you know, because of who they are. So yeah.
Such a silly tangent, but that just made me think of the older movie, like 90s movie or whatever, Bring It On, where she's like, I know there's such thing as overwhelmed and there's a such thing as underwhelmed, but is there such thing as just whelmed? I've never thought of dystopia.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that's right on, is just that like the world we're fighting for hopefully is one where everybody gets to define what the world looks like for them.
Yeah.
But yeah, you mentioned the sort of research around how a lot of technology that exists today was inspired by science fiction. What is that from?
Yeah, in my master's thesis, I've come across a whole combination of studies coming out of Europe, the US, and Canada that tie technology to their origin point. And so, like, these are investigative ethnographic studies that try to figure out like what the features are of like an iPad, for instance, and where they might have emerged first, where the like components would have emerged first. And
Cool studies.
super cool studies, super cool studies. And just the sheer volume was shocking to me. Sheer volume of technologies that have come out of science fiction was shocking to me too. I went in like with a hunch, I guess, and then was like, oh, I was thinking like 20%. But it's like huge. It's like everything from like the subway system to the credit card to the like iPad to like Google Glass, like the list goes on, even to like the ways in which we imagine Wi-Fi or wireless devices. And so it was shocking to me to see how extraordinary in volume that was, but also just like, oh, it made me sick because I know that these like books and movies and films are produced by like white men. And so it's really a question that's kind of sat with me since then, which is just like, who writes the future? And it's not even in like an imaginative, like speculative way. It's like literally written and literally existing decades later, sometimes just years later in the world that we operate. I'm like looking at all the technology around me right now and recognizing that it was like written into existence by a demographic that doesn't look like me. And what might it look like if it had been written by an Octavia Butler or N.K. Jemisin or, like a Nettie Okafor? Like, how would it be different? How would it serve me differently or serve us as a society differently,
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I watched Dune last night even, and it's a beautiful work. But yeah, it's a very specific point of view, and
it's super specific point of view. But it's also a question of like, who's writing me into the future, or who's writing my, like, we've been using this word at the SFPC in my sci-fi writing class. Who's writing for my kinstellation? Like all of the people that maybe not are blood related, but are like, pieces of the things that I care about embodied in individuals who have yet to come, this constellation of people who are like, in ways touching upon the things that I care about, the kin in that map. Like who's writing for them, like who's writing them into the future that becomes the technology, that becomes the thing that's in our pocket,
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that's, I mean, imagine if you ran a technology company, like it makes sense to me, of course, that why would you not just sort of scan through imaginative, speculative work? Because it takes away a lot of the job that you have to do to imagine something completely new. So,
totally.
Yeah. But of course,
my friends and I are like always joking that these sci-fi companies aren't reading to the end of the book because a lot of the technologies are coming out in like chapters 1 through 10, and then they don't read to the end to see how it destroys humanity. And they're like, cool, I'll make a company based on this. And the end of the book has the lesson, not like the cool flashy tech at the beginning,
totally.
Yeah,
which is such a lesson for what happens with our own technology when we don't really think about how it like actually impacts human behavior and what the sort of end result is. That the
exactly
sort of end result is different than the intended purpose so often. Well, what else? If there's anything else you would want to make sure to mention or talk about, I was also just going to talk about ask what's getting you excited right now? Like, what are you working on maybe right now, or things that you're sort of newly mashing together even that would be really exciting to you or you're really excited about? And also people that you're just really inspired by right now, whether it's like actual present day humans or past ancestors or whatever that might be.
Yeah, those are great questions. Yeah, well, I think that the stuff I'm working on right now, I'm really excited about some of the projects on the horizon. I mean, I'm trying to do a lot more writing in my work, and I think a lot of my work has begun as like chicken scratch writing on pages that have turned into like an art installation, or have turned into like a video, or have turned into a workshop, but they are based on like the storytelling that I think I would like to explore more deeply as stories. And so that's one of the things that's really exciting about this SFPC, the School for Poetic Computation class, because it is like the whole experimental class is around building a like a practice of writing that draws upon sciences from people of color in those industries, and draws upon science fiction from people of color as well. And so, you know, I just signed a contract to have like just almost indefinite iterations of this course at the SFPC.
Yes.
Yeah, and it's really lovely because each course ends in a publication, like a printed
Oh,
book
wow.
with the student
Cool.
work. Yeah, so it's really wonderful to write together and read together, and that intimacy, I think, is something I've been missing from a lot of the work in the pandemic as well. Like Investing in Futures had that in folds, but it's really rare to find the right combination. As I said in, I think, the Instagram post we just sort of referenced, the right combination of like people, place, and task that feels like intimate, you know, in your work. And so I'm really excited about that. And I'm doing some writing for a couple of like Black centered magazines, and just really trying to find other ways, similar to that quote you've read aloud, some other ways to sort of like build transmissions of these thoughts that I think are showing up in various ways in my like non conventionally written work, you know.
Yeah, and I just to interject about writing, I mean, one of the reasons I love writing so much is because it is sort of like a prophetic art. I mean, there's someone here in Denver, Eutimia Cruz Montoya, who knows Asia and sort of that group of friends, and she once said, actually, I think it was in a social permaculture design course with Kendra, that I think I heard her say like words are prayer. And I think there is a way in which writing the future is a prayer. It's an act of
Yeah,
hoping for something, like you said, sort of toward the beginning. It's a hope for something that's not yet seen.
right.
And writing for me differently than any form of, maybe sculpture or other like physical art form or something. And I mean, I guess you can make arguments, of course, for all of it, right? Like painting,
Sure.
all those are all forms of sort of prayer, or, especially if they're speculative, like they're ways that we're hoping for something that's not yet here.
Yeah,
But I think there is something really cool to me about writing that feels like a lineage of prophetic tradition. And also, so it's like, I mean, just what you're talking about at the School of Poetic Computation, right? It's like reaching back into the past, sort of
yeah,
continuing a lineage of people who have done that and
yeah,
now are writing into the future of like, what can we then pull forward into the
yeah,
present? So yeah, I love writing in that way because I think there is really
yeah,
something mystical about language and words. And I mean, that's where also I find a lot of overlap with like coding and that sort of, like that is
yeah,
a language. And in that way, it's also can be, and even in AI, like that's sort of a prophetic tradition also.
yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree. And I think that there's like maybe, you know, I just love that this is connected to ancestors, because it's on the forefront of my mind, because we've been talking about it and talking about the class I'm teaching. They're really into ancestors. We talk a lot about like what would it mean? What kind of ancestor do we want to be, thinking about ourselves at like one point in a timeline, and who might we serve with our knowledge of today for a better future, for even just like a different future.
Yeah.
And it has me really thinking about oral histories and written histories of my matriarchs specifically. I feel like really lucky, and I'm sure lots of people have this experience too, to be tied to like a really strong sort of backbone of matriarchs. And so I think that, like, you know, to me, it has me thinking about the oral traditions. I have one grandmother who wrote a lot of stuff down, and one that was just like a talker, like a real talker. So it has me thinking about these oral histories and how to like, you know, sink back into them and figure out what lessons are there, how to like revive them into the work that I have, that I'm trying to like put forward into the world. And also just like looking at all these like cues. I mean, just to see the patterns of like, again, intimacy and connectivity that emerge in song for my history, and in food for my history, and recognize that those things are part of my like cognitive making. And so maybe leaning into those deeper. Like I do a lot of work related to food already, but like leaning into them harder or deeper might also be a great way to open myself up to my own creative potential, because it's part of my framing for what it means to feel care, to feel community, to feel Black, you know?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, those are things that I'm really into right now, that have just shown up in classes, but also just been like things I've been chewing on. No, bad pun.
No, yeah, but well, I was going to say, not even just cognitively, like they don't just make you up cognitively. They literally make up your, not just your DNA, but also talking about fermentation and bacteria, they make up your gut. I have a, actually my conversation for the podcast with Asia was on microbes and spirituality. And part of that is we talk about the, I think it's Malaysian tradition, like the dairy farmers of Malaysia who pass down dairy cultures to like generationally, and it is considered a form of wealth. But like it actually ends up making up your gut bacteria. So you were quite literally making up the next generation and
100%.
sort of living forward. And I think too, it's part of why I've always, I think, really loved podcasts too, because it is an oral tradition. Like we're storytelling in a way that is using that spoken word. And I also, interestingly, I was just remembering when you said that my grandmother passed away like 10 years ago or 12 years ago. And I actually don't have a strong connection to the matriarchal line of my family for various reasons. And when my grandfather died just a couple of years ago, you know, we inherited all of their stuff. And part of that was all of my grandmother's recipe cards. And it was interesting because I was doing all this fermentation work with Asia at the time. And so I had started cooking all these things, you know, like, nutritious broths and soups and all this stuff, and was cooking all this stuff that I hadn't really ever cooked before. And I hadn't even heard of before, like Greek soups. And I don't think any of our lineage is necessarily Greek, but I went back later to look through the recipe cards of my grandmother, and it was like liver pate and like this Greek soup that I had just started making that I'd never even heard of before, and then saw that she had actually made it before. And so I've been wanting to do some sort of art project that was like it was like for her, it's also like that's a written history, is like recipe cards. So it's like that intersection of foods and, you know, written and oral history passed down generationally also, that then also makes up our gut bacteria, that like we are quite literally our ancestors.
Totally. Exactly. I'm remembering a quote. It's just like, from bacteria to dust. I need to find it basically because it's killing me. But yeah, I think that the points that you're making, I love that this is something that we can talk about, because sometimes I present these ideas and people are like, you're bananas. And I'm like, no, but for real, like this but actually. And I think that one of the cool things about this whole conversation is it also proves to us parts of unseen connectivity that we don't even think about, right? The ways in which we're like inherently tied to one another, whether like it decenters the like importance of the brain and the like speech pattern, and really talks about like what is there's all kinds of things happening below that part of your body and on your skin, on your face, that are you know, operating in even more progressive ways than us, if we want to touch back on the slime mold thing, but also tie us to one another
too. The recipes are like a way, I mean, talking about slime mold, you're like passing resources to each other. Like my grandmother literally passed me a resource from a different generation forward in time to me, you know?
Right, exactly. Yeah, I want to just I have this quote on my phone right here. It's by this writer. Oh my gosh, I'm obsessed with everything that this writer produces. This is from a compilation called Critical Booch that Lorraine Fournier assembled. This writer's name is Shayna Agbayani, and the quote is, "Bacteria are our oldest ancestors. They bring us the techniques and teachings of everlasting balance, resiliency, and community power that beckon futures of regenerative possibility. As stronger strains of antibiotics are developed, strains of antibiotic-resistant bacteria emerge even stronger too. And this reminds me of the way that humans, animals, plants, microbes, and any beings we try to control under colonialism and other systems of oppression can very well grow in strength by their own resilience and regenerative magic." And it's not clear in this quote, but she is talking about gut bacteria in this chapter, and talking about the ways that we can nurture through cultural understandings of like the histories of our people, and ingesting the food and fermented food, especially of our people, can help like strengthen the gut bacteria that we have. But I just love the way that it's like tied to ancestry, and it's talking about the resilience of like anti-structures and like anti-movements. And I think that that's, you know, exciting in the ways that we think about how we're like tied to one another. Maybe there are internal, maybe gut-based ways to pull tenacity and strength into your daily practice to be more involved in your social political movement. I mean, a lot of these things are both true and
so
also
real.
both theoretical, you know, and I think, yeah, it's exciting.
Well, even, I mean, even with like what we're learning scientifically about the connection between like gut and brain connection, but
Yeah,
also gut and adrenals, and like
yeah,
our literal like energy stores and our ability to participate in, you know, organizing or political work,
right,
or really anything, purpose work, doesn't really
yeah,
matter, like is genuinely affected by our generational ancestry and our current
right.
gut bacteria and all those things. Um, and was I going to say something? You said something else. I was remembering also that sort of reminded me of your project that was the growing the tree that was from your sort of
Yeah,
ancestry, also that isn't native to where you are, but you sort of trick it into thinking it's native so that then
yeah,
you can ingest something that doesn't have all of the sustainability bad side effects,
right.
which is
You've
really
really done your
cool.
homework. Yeah.
That's so
Uh,
cool.
yeah, that project was so fun. I mean, that showed in a bunch of different places in Toronto and the States. And yeah, that the initial conception of that was like a challenge basically from the like curator. Its first showing was in at Band Gallery in Toronto, which is like a Black gallery.
Mm.
And so the like challenge was to say like, what does like food sovereignty look like? What does it mean to like think about, specifically to think about how we like, there is a nuance to the conversation around like food justice that is particular to people of color in ways that is different from other people. And you know, it shows up in non-POC culture too. But I guess like for me, and I know for my parents, it is a active like resistance and resilience to consume food from our culture as a
Mm-hmm.
way to preserve that culture
Yeah,
in a
it's like
society that isn't modeling that culture, you know.
anti-assimilation sort of active
Exactly,
resistance. Yeah.
exactly. They're like chicken foot stew and they're like oxtail and the whole like you know, I like grew up in a really white small town, and like the oddities of that food was just
Mm.
things I was like, you know, trying to like dodge matrix style as conversational topics. But yeah, it's an act of like, you know, preservation, cultural preservation. But I mean, it doesn't contribute very well to the like broad conversation around like food justice, because these foods are from super far away most of the time. Like the fruits that my family like to consume, or like even just like thinking of like the baked goods, but like the vegetables, the animal products, like oftentimes these are from like elsewhere, you know. And so like a lot of people who with African descent and like Jamaican descent, like West Indian descent, like just so many folks who are from tropical regions, I think there is a little bit of friction inside, because you're like, a lot of harm went into bringing this over here. But this
Mm-hmm.
is also the way that I invest in my culture and pass that culture on to the
Yeah.
people in my world, right?
It's a
And
little like the
so
pecan reference, right? Like you've been sort of
yeah,
forcibly removed from somewhere else, and now apparently you're supposed to eat something that's around you, but it's not indigenous to you and your culture. And
right,
yeah, it would take a lot
totally.
of resources to get something to a tree from another continent.
Totally. And a lot of harm for people who look like me, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like a lot of, you know, there was like a moment a couple of years ago that was really talking about the harm that goes into transporting avocados from like Central America to here, and just like all of the people of color who are working in like extraordinarily violent circumstances to make sure that we can have avocados all year round, you know. And like if avocados, they're not inherently tied to like my cultural background, but if they are tied to your cultural background, then like what does that mean? What you're grappling with that friction in your head.
Mm-hmm.
Anyways, so the challenge was like, how do we imagine our way out of like being complicit in that like harm? And so the solution for me and a few collaborators was to imagine a future generation of people of color, of like Caribbean descent people of color, who were also like super like, I want to say like techno crafty, that were just like able to like whip up. In a lot of ways, the people like myself who built these exhibitions, we are living that right now, where we can just like whoop, like code and build and structurally form like these tanks that would trick a plant into thinking it was in its home country. So this tree tank piece through APIs to the web, like API ties to the weather network websites, basically like figured out what Jamaica's weather patterns were. And it was like, oh, it's humid there right now. So there's like these little humidifiers that would go off, or like it's light there right now. So the lights would be on. And when it's nighttime there, the lights would be off. And it would
Holy
just,
cow. I
it
didn't even
wasn't
realize
perfect.
it was that. I thought it was just sort of
Yeah.
like, here's the general climate, but you actually were
Right.
like mimicking the real life, like climate that was
Yeah.
happening. That's so rad.
Yeah, this is like an early piece of mine, so it like worked almost all the time. I guess it's not really like, I don't need to tell you all that, but
No,
it was
you're
like,
fine. Just claim
you
it.
know, it's like not a perfect exhibition, but yeah, the point was to like through tech actually like physically mimic it as like a prototype. And this idea was actually robbed from me by a little technology company that started releasing these cabinets that look 99% like my cabinets for plants to grow in that mimicked the weather that they were originally from. So, you know, it's I didn't want to turn it into a company, but it is people on one week of the year, like in 2018, people in droves sent me the link to this company. I was like, oh my God. It was like hundreds of links. I'm like, I know. But yeah, you know, art maybe influencing stuff. I don't know. Yeah. But yeah, it was a really fun thought experiment because with some functionality. And that's my kind of favorite kind of art piece that's like, hey, here's a novel idea that might unpin us from some of the ways that we're feeling fictitious about our life as people of color, but also it kind of works. And like this micro prototype could exist in the future and like does now, like, you know, but I mean, like it's fun to be a kind of artist that could also show some functional pieces. There's all these studies that show that if you're imagining futures and you're like working together to speculate on the future, if you can build an artifact of that future today, people are more likely to like lean into the possibility and the plausibility and actually do work to get there, and be closer to that future. And so to be a technologically driven artist is kind of fun because you have some capacity to show people what's possible because of the way that we center tech, you know?
Yeah, that is the sort of difference to me between like writing and doing actual like built work, you know, that you can prototype type something where like when I write about something, it's just like, well, that's a cute idea. And I don't know if that's ever going to happen, but like, yeah, there is and sorry, not to like diminish it at all, but there is something really cool about, like you're saying, being an artist who can also create prototypes that, yeah, show us that it can be done.
One of the cool things about writing is that you can like articulate a social structure that seems really plausible, which is hard to do with like beeps and boops and tech, you know, like some cabinets and servos and whatever, and fog machines. It's a little bit harder to do than to like Adrienne Maree Brown style lay out a whole system that could be better than what we have from a people-based practice, you know.
I was gonna say too, just sort of cap that note, maybe circling back a little bit, like you were talking about like the next networks we don't even see, you know, and all of this stuff. And, you know, even just that, like, you know, Asia teaches me fermenting, and then I go in to talk about the metaphor there, and you also know her, and you know Kendra, and you guys are teaching this class together, and then you go on to do such and such, you know, like that there is sort of this like invisible network of, you know, like work and sharing of resources and passing, you know, on information and data so that that can be shared and moved along sort of deal that's like also happening at a social level.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really nice point. And also it ties back to some of the ways that like we're building these like little webs of community that are trying to achieve similar things. It's like, it's really, again, like a resilience practice, right? Because it feels insurmountable to do these if in your head you're doing it alone, right? But it is beautiful to have, I mean, one of the lovely natures of this podcast alone is to like be like a central node of like many different people branching out to do these things. And we need those kinds of structures. We need those art exhibitions that bring artists together who are thinking about that. Or like reading compilations like Octavia's Brood that are, you know, all of these people, and then they like link through this one thing, and that one thing goes on, you know, and that's really nice.
Yeah. Well, okay, so to finish out, who right now are you just really like is just inspiring the crap out of you, that's like mashing together really cool things right now?
Oh my gosh. Well, you already spoke to him. Like Tyler Thrasher is, oh my God. Like couldn't I have like, they're just behind me. I'm like leaning the wrong way. There's like one of his night trees, the glowing ones. And I have I have his little like crystallized snail shell right here too.
Yes.
And it's not easy to get these things to Canada, Tyler.
Oh,
But
interesting.
but anyways, I think his work is so dynamic, and it also ties we could just talk forever about this, but it also just ties to the like deep recesses of my soul that are connected to gardening and growing food. Like my parents are avid gardeners, and like seed collection is really important, and like just have like hundreds of
Speaking of
memories.
ancestors and passing things down, like seeds are a dope version of that.
100%. Yeah, 100%. Yeah. So I think that like, that if I had $1 for every time my grandmother would be like eating a mango and get to the pit and be like, mangoes aren't the same that they used to be. Like, you know what I mean? Like, it's just, you don't know what a mango is in like, a loving way. Like, but yeah, I think Tyler's work is like super futuristic by happenstance almost, because I don't know that I hear him talk a little bit about the like futurism web that he's just like nestled into. It's like inventing species and like doing a lot of things that are like showing up in my like N.K. Jemisin books. And it's so cool to see that like alive in a human being. And like I like to think that maybe there are people who look at my work and see it as like a living version of like maybe what other speculations of people of color might do. And I have so many people who I know who are that for me too. And speaking of seeds, one other person whose work really like just always inspires me is Christina Battle. She's a Black artist out of Alberta. And her practice is very seed driven, looking at seed constellations, seed galaxies, looking at like inherited lineages of seeds, and like planting and gardening together. And so, I think that I think that stuff is so exciting and also so necessary now, as we like really need to be in contact with like soil and land and earth to like remind ourselves of our like purpose and existence in this pretty bleak atmosphere.
There's so many connections there, like food in general. I mean, like you're saying, gardening also, I was just thinking like that is also a form of art. Like, it is a built art, like you're talking about, like growing a food and co-collaboration with nature and getting to know your land and all of those things.
Totally. The land stewardship component of that is imperative to how we sort of move out of this era with new wisdom, because people are becoming more connected to the space around them. We have no choice. I mean, a lot of people have been stuck at home for the last 2 years, right? So if we can graduate out of this pandemic with some more food and land stewardship understanding, I think that's like a huge gain. We've never had like a full societal chapter where maybe we all reinvest in that. My parents talk about all the time, they're like, other people must be gardening because there are less bugs and aphids around. Like, there are less bugs eating our plants. We're sharing the bugs. Other people must be gardening. Awesome. I think Christina's work really inspires me. And then I guess the last person whose work is like just ever inspiring is Netta Bomani, and their work, just thinking about the colonial histories of hardware and talking about the ways in which like circuit boards and the design of circuit boards came from like slave ship design, and looking at those two tied histories. And it's like deeply uncomfortable because of the way that we glorify technology and glorify circuitry, and hardware has especially this sort of like hyper nuanced skill to be able to do, because it requires like an understanding of electrons and code and assemblage. And I think that, we're still not really comfortable talking about the like the slave ship and like all of these like objects, these really big objects that are like tied to the colonial histories. Like there's comfort isn't the right word, but we're leaning it. We've learned to lean into the topics of like slavery, but like these sort of like really technically designed systems, like chattel collars and like the slave ship, these objects that were like also tied to like imperial design. We're not like, that doesn't come up. It's not as comfortable to talk about the reality of how that is in part how we know how to design like this object that we're speaking on right now, these laptops and these technologies. And I just think Netta is just completely unearthing all of that. Their work is like, a lot of their publications are called Dark Matter, and so it's certainly worth diving into this like spectacular combinations of things that are mutually uncomfortable because of the ways that we like shy away from one topic and really like love another topic. Yeah.
And there's just like a lifetime of reading I need to do.
Yeah, exactly.
uh, but yeah, well, here's oh, I was gonna ask too, just like personally, do you follow It's Holly on Instagram?
I don't, maybe. I mean, I don't think so. It's
What a
Holly,
joy
maybe.
she has brought to my life. Yeah, she's
Okay.
just a chef and sort of I think became sort of known through like TV cooking competitions or something, but
Cool.
has like really made a place for herself, sort of like Tyler on Instagram. So has this huge following, and like watching her stuff is just like such a like she just is such a joy to see. But she also cooks oxtail and like all these things you were
Mm,
talking about that.
yeah.
Um, I was like, oh, she needs to follow Holly if she doesn't,
Yeah.
because Holly's amazing,
Oh my
and
gosh.
gorgeous, and just like the most amazing. She seems like the most amazing human. Um, but yeah, like here's hoping for the future. I was just imagining too, the like someday when there's like some speculative art, like a maybe a sci-fi movie created where like Tyler actually gets to create like an entire set of like
Yeah,
crystallized bugs, and
totally.
like something we can experientially like walk into or like
Oh
see on
yeah.
screen or something would just be so fantastic. Like a
Oh
whole
my
field.
gosh.
Could you imagine just like, I want him to be like, I mean, funded sort of like, I mean, CJ Hendry and these like really large installation artists that you
Yeah.
see, um, that like you just see like a field of glowing,
Yes.
flowers or
Oh
whatever.
my
And
God, absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah, I could not want that for him enough. I want like writers to write him into all of these like things that just get like, where's the Tyler Thrasher children's book? Like I
Yeah.
want I want like all of this content, because I think that, yeah, I think that there's also this like magical property that he is occupying. Magical is not the right word. It's just intimate. It's just vulnerable to
Mm-hmm.
talk about like how, we also have to be human and care about each other. And we can only do this in
Mm-hmm.
community. And like, this is about passing on things to like other generations and feeling playful and imaginative. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that stuff, again, talking about things that aren't allowed to exist together, like, just the like whimsy and science. I don't know,
Yeah.
it's not super common, and I think that that's so wonderful,
Mm-hmm.
that he brings that to us, like, every day.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's
Yeah.
part of why, I mean, originally, of course, I wanted to talk to him about just science and art, mashed together, because that's just what he does. But um, yeah, I think everyone talks to him about that. And I love the part that, like, his vulnerability around talking about trauma and his past,
Yes.
and
Yeah,
how important it is to understand the intersections of trauma with all of those things, I
totally.
think is so great that he does that.
Yeah, totally.
Um,
Yeah, it's really amazing.
yeah. Well, anything else, Ashley, before we close up?
I don't think so. I mean, um, yeah, we've talked about so much. I feel like we've just like,
We've gone all over.
yeah, like just shot through so many things. I think that, like, I guess to like hype some of the stuff that would be coming out at this time. I mean, I'm working with the SFPC to continue launching iterations of the course, reading into the past, writing into the future. And so those will be made available for registration in the fall and the summer and the spring. So there's all these opportunities, I think, to
Yeah.
dive in, if that's like a place like of intimate care and knowledge, reading and writing, and centering science, but from the Black, Indigenous, person of color perspective. If that feels meaningful, I'd love to see people there. I'm also working on some VR pieces for the first time, which is like high key stressful for me, because I've like for a long time secretly been like proudly anti VR, and now I'm just like, somebody was like, do you want to do a VR piece rather for Black futures, and I was like, damn,
Yeah.
yeah, I think I do.
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. I'm like sort of anti, like I have a tendency to be anti, but like I went to the California Science Museum when I went to a science conference and at the end of 2019, and it was the first time I sat down in a VR, and it was like um it was just space flight from Earth to Mars. And which
Yeah.
sounds so cheesy, but like that alone I was like, that was wild. Like that
Yeah,
just
right.
blew my mind. So like like thinking of the things that you could do with VR is super
Yeah.
cool.
Oh my God. Yeah, totally. So I'm
Wait, did
like,
you say VR or AR?
I said VR.
Yeah, okay. Yeah,
But
that's what I
yeah,
meant.
totally. Yeah. The headsets, I mean, I just, yeah, I'm like happily struggling through it, because I'm like, this is cool. This feels good. But also it's like, when you get sort of a high on your horse about like things, and then you like you have to like you're like, oh, okay,
backtrack
well,
on it.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's that. So I have an exhibition coming out. I have a piece in an exhibition coming out at Trinity Square Video, which is a gallery in Toronto on like Black futures, which I'm really stoked about, and have a piece and a series of work coming out with Backflash magazine, which I'm also really stoked about. And then, you know, the Google feature on my work and about slime mold is either would have just come out or is coming out, depending on when this podcast is released.
I'll make sure to link to it regardless. So even if it comes out after we publish, I'll go back and add it if I see it.
Thank you. Yeah, it's really, I'm not sure exactly how it's going to turn out. I hope it's good because I'm mentioning it, but it's in promotion for this branch of women tech makers, which is this like massive org helping a lot of women get into technology in various ways, scholarship and skill building and networking. They are launching Black women tech makers for the first time, and me and just 3 others are being featured as part of like a promotional campaign to demonstrate what kind of technologies exist, or like what are we imagining when we think about like Black women in tech, and how are we maybe, you know, breaking some of the molds about just coding in a dark room. There's more exciting ways to be involved in tech than that, you know.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
All right. Awesome.
Cool.
Well, thank you for all of your time. I'm so glad we finally got to chat.
Yeah,
I've had all these little nodes that connect to you, but have not actually had direct contact with you. So it's super fun to actually get to talk to you.
Yeah, and thank you for your great questions and just all of the, it's so exciting to talk to people who are like deeply excited by these subjects, because I mean, I didn't even have to like bring up all the things that were fun about like the stuff that I care about, because you're already like into it. And I love having conversations with people like that, just like multi-dimensional thinkers. It's really a lot of fun.
There is truly like no end to, it's very difficult not to continue in this conversation just because it's like, I mean, sci-fi alone, I just like, it's one of those things where I get so geeked out about it. My brain just sort of like collapses in on itself. I'm like, I don't even know how to articulate words. I'm like, there's just something so cool about, like I said, sort of a prophetic tradition of being like, oh no, and it's so relevant. I mean, it's always been relevant, but you know, we live now, so it feels super relevant just to be like, you know, like you said, I mean, I think especially around the murder of George Floyd, that like there was just so much opportunity to just be stuck in grief and sad and dark, and go like, when will this ever end? And sci-fi, it's cool also just to hear that like it's real, that when you like that 87% or whatever, you know, that the stat is about like most of our technology being imagined. It's like, well then cool. Like if I write something, the opportunity to actually like genuinely influence the future is real. That's not just like a maybe. That's
right. And it's a superpower that is like afforded to, I think, the wrong demographic. And so, you know, I think that's the part that's like so cool in your like this and that, like matching. It's like there's in that knowledge, there's no argument that says that like science and art are disconnected, because that proves that it's completely connected. Because if we have like all this creative writing that becomes real, you know, then like there is no questioning about the impact of art, because we are living it right now all the time through the very means in which we're talking at this moment, you know.
Right. And the countless times I'm sure that like literal scientists, even outside of technology, quote unquote, have been like watching a work of art and went, oh my God, I hadn't even thought about that as an explanation of the nature of the universe. And now I see dark matter in an entirely different way. And I'm going to try this experiment. Like we have no idea the ways that like art has influenced scientific breakthrough and how science has influenced art, you know? So it's so cool that it feels like an act of like at once like resistance and participation and engagement and creation, not just of like, oh, look at this cool art piece I'm going to sell in a gallery, but like literally creating the future.
Yeah, and it makes this new form of transmission to your constellation as you as an ancestor, right? Like because Octavia Butler is no longer with us, but her work lives on in the technology around us, in the workshops that we host, in the conversations that we hold, right? So there's something really cool about writing science fiction as an act of ancestor, right? To be like, well, you know, I'm going to put this idea out into the universe, and maybe it will be something that does live in the pocket of people to come, you know.
Yeah.
And so I think that that's like, it's a really fun, it's really fun to think about these things as like transmissions to the future, and to think of yourself in that way as like a writing based ancestor of people you've not yet met, you know.
Yeah. Or even, yeah, when I found those, the like recipe cards for my grandmother, I was also
Yeah.
thinking about just like, yeah, again, the like, it's not just metaphor that my grandmother has
Yeah.
passed down, you know, her gut bacteria to me.
Yeah.
You know, if she's been eating those things and now I'm eating those things, you know, like those things literally transcend time. And
Yeah.
I was trying to think of a way that like, you know, I was making kraut a lot, and I was like, kraut is actually like a really cool art form. Like you could use it as a
Yeah.
print. So I like,
Oh,
I was like
cool.
slicing cabbage in half and dipping it in black ink and then
Oh
pressing
my
it on
God, so
translucent
cool.
paper. And I was like, I was trying to experiment with like how you could show generational gut bacteria, you know, like that
Yes. Yes.
on translucent paper, I could do like layers, and like if you
Yeah.
could light through it, that it could like show some form of like physical embodiment of like the way that gut bacteria is passed down generationally. Um,
Totally.
so yeah, I just started like experimenting with a lot of that, like in physical, like art form, to be like, how could
Yeah.
I use her recipe cards? How could I use like fermentation to sort of like actually show this idea of, yeah, us passing things to each other through time.
Totally, totally. There are a few artists who are thinking about ways of doing this in sourdough starters that have been inherited like generation after generation. Like,
Mm-hmm.
can you map? Is it worth like taking a like, you know, microscope sample of that now, so that like in 10 years when that gets passed on, like you take another sample? And this is like a multi-generational art project, obviously, but
Yeah.
how cool like the that there are like there are these things that you can eat that also resemble the gut bacteria of your ancestors, but they're also like the thing, you know, like
Mm-hmm.
the sourdough starter that has been around for like 3 generations, like creepily sitting in the back of your fridge, as my parents would say
Yeah.
about the one that I have in my home. But yeah, my grandmother started a black cake. This is like it's like a fermented fruit cake, basically, in black
Whoa.
in West Indian culture, and it's like it's got to be about 27 years old, and I have like a part of it that I have to like, you know, add alcohol and dried fruit to sustain it, so that I can like once a year make this black cake for holidays. But it's just like this thing that me and my cousins all have from our grandmother. So it's like they're also the thing. There's the like emulation of it in gut bacteria that is like biologically the same, but then some people also have that like old jar of, you know, maybe like hooch that your family
Yeah.
has been holding on to or saving, or maybe like an old jar of pickles that just continues to be fed. And those
Mm-hmm.
things are really cool too, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, you can pass brine down, like all
Yeah.
those things. Yeah, super cool. Okay, well, to
Anyways,
respect your
yes,
time, yeah,
yes, yes.
we could do this for a while.
Yeah.
So yeah, thanks again for your time. So fun to get to meet you, and
Yeah.
from a distance and time. No, you have a fermentation friend and
Oh,
all these other sci-fi nerdy things that we're both obsessed with. So
yeah, same to you. It's been so lovely connecting. It does feel like we're just sitting talking in the same room, which is nice.
yeah, great.
Yeah.
That's what I want.
Cool.